Hello and welcome back to the Data Privacy Lawyer. It's Funmi, Principal Attorney speaking. Today we're going to be taking a look at ASUS. I want to take a look at their privacy notice. If they have a cookie notice and there's time, we'll also take a look at that as well. So ASUS basically sells electronics. I want to take a look at different US companies and see what they're doing in terms of data protection. So we can see here that we've been presented with the cookie banner. That's excellent. Let's actually click and see the cookie notice. So we're actually on the privacy policy here. I'm going to manage my settings, which I always do. I've actually been given the opportunity to opt in. Now this is really very important for consumers to review every time they go on a website belonging to an organization. And I'll tell you why. A cookie is considered personal data under the data protection laws. Now, I presume that ASUS operates globally. The first thing that organizations need to understand is the geographies where you provide your products and service will influence your obligations under the data protection laws. Now, that's the first thing. Now, this is considered a preference center. And what happens here is I've just landed on the ASUS page. And because ASUS is trying to obtain some of my personal data as I interact with the website, they have to give me the option to opt in to certain cookies that are not necessary or mandatory. Now, there are some cookies that are mandatory and cookies are considered personal data. Now, I've been opted out. I can choose to opt in. I never do on this site because I want to show and demonstrate what organizations are doing. Generally, as a privacy counsel, I can tell when an organization operates in the European Union because the privacy laws and the obligations an organization has in Europe are very different to those that are required in the United States. The fact that I have been opted out and I will then be presented the opportunity to opt in indicates that ASUS is aware of its obligations in the European Union to ensure that they present consumers the opportunity to opt in. And sometimes you'll visit sites and you've already been opted in. And the reason why you might have already been opted in is because the privacy laws in your geography state that the company can opt you in already. But in Europe, it's not so. In Europe, companies have to give consumers the opportunity to opt in. They should always be opted out, which is what we can see here. And I also want to make note of something else. I love the fact that ASUS has different colors when an individual chooses to opt in. You can see if you opt in, it's very clear that you've opted in. It's blue, right? But if you've opted out, it's gray. And I'll tell you why this is very important. Some companies try to confuse consumers on exercising their privacy rights. Now, there's a term for this, and I won't go into too much detail about what this is, but it's called a dark pattern. And it's basically an emphasis by some companies to confuse users so that the company can collect more personal data than the consumer is aware of, right? I'm a privacy lawyer, so I'm familiar with different processes that companies follow when they're trying to collect personal data and what they have to do to comply with data protection laws. I'm not going to harp on too much about dark patterns, but ultimately it's really good that we've been presented with this as we landed on ASUS's page. So I'm going to confirm my choices and I've decided to remain opted out. Let's take a look at the policy or notice. So they have two parts. And, before I'd even gotten to this privacy policy, I knew that ASUS provides services in the European Union just based off of that manage your settings pop-up that we received as we landed on the site, okay? ASUS Tech Computer Inc. are dedicated to protecting your privacy and data and complying with the privacy laws. That's excellent. That's ultimately what these privacy policies and cookie policies and notices are all about. It's about complying with the privacy and data laws, okay? So this particular policy explains how ASUS collects, uses, and safeguards your personal data online and offline. I would be intrigued about what constitutes offline for ASUS. I'm sure they have an internal definition of this. I'm pretty sure consumers would be interested in knowing what this means when they say safeguarding your personal data online and offline. This might be in reference to storing your data, but I don't know and I cannot tell. It's based on the language they've used, okay? Personal data refers to any information that could identify you either directly or indirectly. Now, I want to talk about indirectly for a minute because on this channel, we've talked a lot about cookies. Cookies on their face they don't look like typical personal data identifiers. But the fact that they can indirectly identify you as a consumer being, hey, this is Funmi's device. Funmi has logged into eBay in the last 25 days. Indirectly, that cookie that's on my device has identified that I visited eBay, for example. So the fact that a company could identify that I've been on eBay a particular number of times constitutes personal data because it can be traced back to me. Generally, most consumers know personal data to be name or email address. Some consumers don't consider a business email address as personal data, but it is personal data because it identifies you, one, with an organization, and two, generally with business email addresses, it's your first name and your last name, or some iteration of both. How ASUS uses your personal information. To perform the functions of ASUS products and services, I'm just going to go over this generally because we don't have a lot of time to talk about ASUS. And I don't want my reviews to be something that individuals that watch them aren't able to digest because it's very important. And I want there to be a lot more awareness of, one, how important personal data is to organizations, and two, what consumers need to know when they're interacting with companies so that they can know what their rights are, because there are rights that consumers have when it comes to their personal data. And every company that processes your personal data generally will have obligations under data protection laws if they meet those thresholds. And one of the reasons on my channel I always look at global organizations is because my reviews are looking at this from a global perspective. Now, some organizations only have to adhere to data protection laws in the United States because they only process the personal data of US residents. Depending on what your organization does with personal data, influence what your obligations are. And we can already see that ASUS has addressed the fact that they do operate in the European Union. They are processing personal data belonging to European Union residents, and as such, the European Union data protection laws are applicable. I've highlighted the uses by ASUS because one thing that companies need to be aware of is if you're choosing to use personal data in a particular manner, you need to provide notice to your consumers that you're using the personal data for that purpose. That's an obligation you have as a company under the data protection laws. So anytime you choose to use personal data a particular way, you need to make sure that you're putting that representation in your privacy policy or notice. Now, we've talked about this before. I probably will do another video exclusively about cookies. I've already talked about the merits for ASUS and what they're doing in terms of providing consumers their rights under the data protection laws for managing cookie usage. And we can see the different types of cookies that are utilized. Companies need to make sure that all of their usage of cookies, when it comes to like analytics and advertising cookies, if it's not necessary, you need to make sure that you give consumers the opportunity to opt out if it's not a necessary cookie. I really hope you enjoyed this review of the privacy policy offered by ASUS. I do these reviews and I do gap analysis for organizations. If you're an organization, you're looking for a privacy lawyer to help you assess your compliance with the data protection law, take a look at the description below and I'll see you in another review.